So if you look at China's involvement vis-a-vis specified unlawful activities, I can make a very convincing argument that China is responsible for about half of the money laundering in the world every year. As this we know is orchestrated from direct orders from the CCP because their intelligence organs, their military are involved with a lot of this. There is absolutely no doubt that that's true. Call them out and tell the world what they are. They are a ongoing criminal enterprise operating as a state.
Welcome to our investigation into the world of Chinese money laundering during Xi Jinping's tenure. We explore the elusive connections between these crimes and the Chinese Communist Party. We also discuss strategies for proving Chinese governmental involvement. We examine what steps the West can take to combat CCP money laundering, exacerbated by the challenges of open borders and increasing Chinese crossings. Welcome to the show.
Hi everyone, our guest today is John Cassara, who retired after 26 years career in the federal government intelligence and law enforcement communities. His list of accomplishments, his career is so unusual that I will skip the introduction and I will ask him to introduce himself because it would take me too much time. So John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here with you and your guests. You asked me to talk just a little bit about my career, to give my background. As you said, I had a very unusual career. I started off working for the federal government back in 1978, and I was a case officer for the Central Intelligence Agency. I was a spy overseas, and I absolutely loved it. This was during the height of the Cold War, and I still feel myself at times as an old Cold Warrior. I did that job for about 5 years. Unfortunately, I was forced to resign because I fell in love with a young lady in the country I was assigned to. And at that time, it was prohibited to marry a foreign national and work for the agency. So I resigned, but you know what? I had to choose between the woman I loved and the job I loved. I made the right decision because we've been married for over 40 years with 3 children and 7 grandchildren.
Okay.
So after I left the agency, I wanted to continue to work for the government. I worked in the United States Treasury Department for the balance of my career. I did a short stint in the United States Secret Service, protecting the president. This was during the Reagan era. It looks very glamorous from the outside. And on the inside, I got kind of tired of what we call standing post, standing guard. And I thought there was more to life than that, more to a career than that. So I joined the U.S. Customs Service at the time, back when it was in Main Treasury. Customs actually enforces more laws than the FBI does. I wasn't an inspector or somebody you might see at JFK or Washington Dulles Airport. I was a special agent for Customs. So we enforced the law. He had a badge and a gun. And I was an undercover arms dealer for a couple of years with Customs. And then we had a very successful investigations. And then they sent me to Rome to work in the American Embassy. And I headed up the first truly international anti-money laundering task force, working with U.S. Customs and the Italian Guardia Finanza, the fiscal police, looking at the flow of dirty money going back and forth between Italy and the United States to combat the mafia, organized crime. And from there, I went to Treasury's FinCEN, the Financial Intelligence Unit of the United States. I was a customs liaison to FinCEN. I did that for about 6 or 7 years, loved it. And then I transferred over to the State Department on a detail right after the 9/11 attacks and helped orchestrate America's response to the war on terror vis-a-vis money laundering and terror finance. And then I ended my official government career at Main Treasury, working for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence. And after I retired, I continued to work for some of those same government agencies and departments, doing a lot of international training, delivering technical assistance, mentoring. I've written a lot of articles, and I've written 6 books. all on money laundering and terror finance.
Yes, I've looked them up, and they have very good reviews. Also from people from your own industry, which is a great thing. And I saw you published one recently about the Chinese money laundering, and that's actually the topic for today. So I wanted to ask you. Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's the one about Chinese money laundering. And I wanted to ask you to give us like a brief overview of the history. How did it evolve in the, let's say, in the recent decade, maybe since Xi Jinping is in power? And yeah, when has it really taken off? Because it seems it's quite a danger now.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I wrote this book from a rather unique perspective, from a law enforcement perspective. And I don't, to the best of my knowledge, that has not been done before. We look at China vis a vis a military lens or a political lens or an economic lens or a commercial lens or a technical lens. But we've never really looked at it from a law enforcement lens. And I've been fascinated with Chinese transnational crime and associated money laundering going back at least a decade or so. And I first saw this in my overseas travel, primarily in the developing world. I saw, the forerunners of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. I saw how they were going into countries and exploiting countries. And I saw the criminality that was following China wherever it went. There are a number of papers that came out 5, 6, 7 years ago from the OECD and from Global Financial Integrity, some other think tanks that looked at transnational crime as related to certain specified criminal activities. And I looked at this and I said, what they all have in common, every single one of these criminalities was China. China was the common denominator. So that was the genesis of the book. What I did was I looked at what I call the largest, in my opinion, the 12 largest specified unlawful activities, or what we call predicate offenses to charge money laundering. And they are exactly what you'd think they would be: counterfeiting, narcotics, intellectual property rights violations, human trafficking and forced labor, wildlife trafficking, illegal logging, illegal fishing, illicit tobacco, trade fraud, arms trafficking, WMD, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, even organ harvesting. All right. And I would add corruption to that list as well, because corruption is actually a specified unlawful activity for money laundering. If you total up these 12, if you total up all these 12 different categories of crime in very round numbers, that's about $2 trillion a year. $2 trillion. And the reason that's significant from an anti-money laundering specialist point of view is that the global magnitude of money laundering, the estimates vary, but in very round numbers, it's approximately, say, $4 trillion a year, according to the best estimates by the International Monetary Fund and other international bodies. So if you look at China's involvement vis-a-vis specified unlawful activities, I can make a very convincing argument that China is responsible for about half of the money laundering in the world every year, as measured by predicate offenses. And then the other thing I did in my book is I looked at what I call Chinese-centric or CCP-centric money laundering methodologies and enablers. Things like flying money. Fai Chen looked at black market exchanges, Chinese underground banking systems, capital flight, gambling, real estate, their use of offshores and secrecy jurisdictions. And then I looked at other things like their use of free trade zones and all this type of thing. I put it all together, and I was staggered, absolutely staggered by the criminality that I found. The totality of what's going on is overwhelming, and none of us are really focused on it. We're not talking about Chinese CCP Inc., as I call it, transnational crime and money laundering.
Dear viewers, help us overcome algorithm suppression by liking, commenting, and sharing this important content, especially since we talk to world's top experts.
Why is it so? Why do the governments do they only focus on the military and commercial aspect? Why not on the money laundering? Why is this below the radar?
I don't understand, because honestly, and I've been around our government for a lifetime, and in my considered opinion, I believe this is where China, CCP, is absolutely most vulnerable. They are breaking the law around the world. In my country and in every country where they operate, they are breaking the law. And it's obvious and it's glaring, and people just kind of look the other way. And perhaps it's because it's not polite to point it out. Perhaps because doing so is kind of gets your hands dirty and it's kind of messy and it's not a gentlemanly thing to say out loud, but it needs to be said out loud, and the laws need to be enforced, and it's not happening, not in
Okay,
sufficient manner.
but you mentioned CCP, so how can we connect the crime and the money laundering to the CCP, maybe to officials? Is there a way we can establish the connection and then go after them, or at least prove it?
Yes and no. I mean, you hear the expression follow the money, right? Okay. So in theory, what you would do is you would look at a specific crime, which is a predicate offense for money laundering. You would look at the proceeds of that crime, and then you would follow the money, or some cases the value trail, because it's not always money. It's tangible goods. Could be like a trade-based money laundering type of thing. And who is benefiting, right? And follow that trail back to, say, China, and in effect back to the CCP. It sounds fairly straightforward, but it gets very complicated, particularly when you talk about linking it directly to the CCP. And also depends on the crime you're talking about. For example, you can talk about wildlife trafficking. Everybody knows that there's an insatiable demand for ivory in China and in other Asian countries, right? And a lot of commentators think that the very survival of the African elephant is in China's hands. But to make that link with the CCP Inc. is kind of tenuous. But you look at other specified unlawful activities. For example, intellectual property rights violations, IPR theft, right? Many very, very knowledgeable people think that over the last 10, 15 years, IPR theft has been the greatest theft of wealth in all of human history, transferred primarily from the United States to China. Estimates vary, but it's in the upper hundreds of billions of dollars to, say, $1 trillion a year. This, we know, is orchestrated from direct orders from the CCP, because their intelligence organs, their military, are involved with a lot of this. There is absolutely no doubt that that's true. Weapons proliferation also has direct fingerprints to the CCP. So there are things like that. Things could not go on without the CCP's approval, if not tacit aggression. I could keep explaining, but things, for example, just to give you one example, this whole issue right now of China is behind the massive amounts of fentanyl that is pouring into the United States and other countries around the world. China denies it. The CCP denies it. But you have to understand, your listeners have to understand that CCP is a command state. Nothing can happen in China without the CCP's approval. They allow those shipments to continue. But even what's more telling to me is if you get on Chinese websites that are promoting this fentanyl trade, many of these websites are linked to some huge Chinese state-owned pharmaceuticals. And these advertising mediums are allowed to stand. They are not taken down. China is, as we all know, is very adept at taking down information sites that they don't want to exist, but they allow this type of thing to continue. So anyway, just some quick examples, but in my opinion, yes, a lot of this criminality is directly sanctioned by CCP Inc.
Okay, you mentioned examples. So let's say we go to a more practical aspect, to a local level. How does it look like, let's say, on the ground? Like there is a organized crime somewhere in the US city. Like how do they launder? How do they move the money? Could we connect maybe consulates or embassies? Like we can connect them to the political involvement when there is an official visit from China or from Taiwan in the US. We can connect the United Front activities. Can we connect the local governmental representatives also to organized crime?
Yeah, those are two good questions. So let me begin with at the local level. How does it work? How does say Chinese in the United States? Because I'm more familiar with that. How do Chinese in the United States launder? Let's go with drug proceeds. Okay. So I write about this in the book, and I've written some other papers about that. But I'm going to give you one very, very quick example because I think it's a historic example. You have to go back 30, almost 40 years. What we call in the United States the black market peso exchange. I don't know if you've heard of it or not.
No.
It's the largest money laundering methodology in the Western Hemisphere, and it has now spread almost around the world. It started off actually in the late 1960s in Colombia, when Colombian businessmen needed access to hard currency, the US dollars, to buy things for their business, for their industry, right? They needed Marlboro cigarettes, they needed Caterpillar tractors, John Deere tractors, Bell helicopters, whatever it is. The Colombian government put restrictions on that, and the black marketeers in the country were forced to go to the black market to get dollars at a different rate in order to circumvent these restrictions. Okay, that's what started it. Then the drug war started, narcotics trafficking, the cartels, supply met demand in the black market peso exchange. So you had all these drug dollars in the United States. Roughly speaking, about $100 billion a year in drug proceeds in the United States equates to about 20 million pounds of currency. There are lots of different ways that money is laundered, but one of the things that the black market peso dealers invented was buying these drug dollars from the cartels, paying the cartels in Colombia a discount, and they had clean pesos in Colombia. The narcotics traffickers were then away from the rest of the laundering. The peso brokers then took the cash, they placed it into financial institutions under reporting thresholds, and then they used the drug monies that was somewhat laundered to buy commodities, things, the Marlboro cigarettes, the Caterpillar tractors, the Bell helicopters. So they were using drug dollars to buy American-made stuff, and the Americans were not asking any questions. It was kind of willful blindness. So then that developed, and then the Mexican cartels copied what was going on with the Colombians. Okay, and now the Mexican black market peso exchange developed, but starting around 2014, 2015, it changed just a little bit, where instead of buying American, US manufactured things, they were buying Chinese manufactured things, maybe garments and textiles, maybe electronics and other things using drug dollars. And then, probably maybe 5 years ago, it changed again, almost starting with the fentanyl trade, is because the Chinese in the United States that own businesses, cash intensive businesses, whether it be laundromats or restaurants or whatever it is, they would be approached by Chinese brokers working with the cartels, and they would say, "We want you to take this money and swap it. Swap it for Chinese yuan, RMB, back in China," right? So we will agree upon the amount, we'll agree upon the exchange rate. You take the dollars and then transfer RMB from your account back in China to the account that we designate back in China. They do that, and that is in effect the wash. Completely avoids our financial transparency reporting requirements or financial intelligence that was put in place to guard against money laundering in banks, because it's not going through a bank. It's going through phone apps like Alipay or WeChat Pay. We can't really monitor that very well. And then the money, the money that they own in the United States now, lots can happen with it, but a lot of that is used by Chinese in China that want to circumnavigate, if you will, capital flight restrictions in China. So what they're doing is they're buying properties or whatever it is in United States with the drug dollars. Okay. It's kind of complicated, but it's highly, highly efficient. And it's very, very difficult for U.S. law enforcement to, A, to understand it, and B, to counteract it.
So it seems like it's kind of like a money printing machine. There's almost no punishment for them, right?
They're not being punished in sufficient numbers. There's the occasional indictment, there's the occasional investigation, but it's just a drop in the bucket. Just a drop in the bucket. But I want to emphasize, this is not just happening in the United States. This is happening in Europe and in Canada and Australia and New Zealand and countries around the world.
Yeah,
And what's really frightening, just to add,
yes.
the United States, in my opinion, has the best law enforcement in the world. In my opinion, it has the best intelligence services in the world, the best customs services in the world. If it's happening in the United States and we're not basically doing hardly anything to counteract it, what do you think's happening in the developing world where the Chinese are doing the exact same thing?
Thank you, John. So, but could we go back to the officials, let's say to the consulates or embassies? Is
Yes.
there a way to put those people in place and to connect them and to show to the public or to the CCP authorities, hey, your people are involved in this? I guess there have been cases like that, right?
Not enough. In the United States, when you talk about, for example, espionage, and you talk about official Chinese, I'm not just picking on the Chinese, it could be, say, official Russians or whatever other nationality that are involved with the type of illegal activities that you're describing. It's the FBI in my country that has jurisdiction to investigate that. They are swamped. Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, says that China is basically the largest threat they have today. It's very, very difficult to keep up with their activities. I think, to me, what's vitally important, not very well understood and certainly not adequately investigated, and there's not enough intelligence, is the link between, say, the CCP, China, the Chinese government, and organized crime, say the triads or stuff that organized China that are operating in the United States, and their links with the intelligence services and even the United Front, because they are working together, they're talking together. each one kind of specializes in its own thing, but they support each other in either direct or indirect ways. And to my way of knowledge, there's just not enough information known on those relationships, but they're there.
How is the situation in Europe? It seems like the European governments are even less aware and doing
Yes,
less than your own government. So how is the situation there? Is it worse because there is even less punishment?
I believe so. I've lived 8 years of my life in Europe, and I've traveled there numerous times. So I'm fairly familiar with it. I'm not on the ground there anymore, but I share your concerns. The Chinese presence in Europe is very strong, as you are well aware. Obviously, the criminality there is just as strong, just as high in Europe as it is in the United States. Whether again it be human trafficking or narcotics trafficking or intellectual property right theft, counterfeit goods, whatever it is, it's also in Europe. As much as I like to think that the criminal investigative services in Europe are professional and are robust, there's still a lot lacking, and punishments are not severe. And once again, I think a lot of it comes to knowledge. The China is a very, we say in intel and law enforcement, hard targets. China, it's a hard target. It's a very hard target to work. It's out of, for example, when I was working against the mafia, right? I'm an Italian American, right? Could kind of speak the language a little bit, understood the culture a little bit, could understand the mindset, and it was Western, right? You could it was very difficult to make sources, but you could break into it. With China, no, it's not our culture. It's not our way of doing business. It's not our way of moving money or transferring value. We don't deal with that. Things like flying money, underground financial systems, we don't understand that at all. We don't have a lot of Mandarin speaking FBI agents or something like that. It's very, very, very difficult to penetrate that kind of familial secrecy, the guanxi, these closed networks, very difficult for outsiders to break into. Chinese know that, and they take advantage of it.
Is it the next case where we are basically helpless, where, like with the military, they challenge us, they provoke us, the Western governments do nothing? Is there anything that we could actually do to protect ourselves?
I think there is. I think there's a lot we can do, but probably the first step is heighten the awareness of the problem. And I don't think that's been done sufficiently. And that's why I applaud you for this type of thing, is to try to get the word out that we should be concentrating on Chinese transnational crime and money laundering, and that it is a major, major threat. One thing I want to emphasize to listeners, having worked in anti-money laundering for many, many, many years, is there's a misconception, because when you are looking at an organized crime group, and I don't care whether they're Italian or Russian or Chinese or Salvadorian or whatever they are not trafficking people for the sake of people. They are not trafficking in drugs for the sake of drugs. They are not stealing cars for the sake of a car. They are doing all these crimes and many, many more for money, avarice, greed, one of the 7 deadly sins, right? It's part of the human condition. And we've done a terrible job, absolutely terrible job, of following the money and value trails and taking away their motivation, which is taking away the things that they want, right? Those palatial homes, the yachts, the shopping centers, all of those things, we need to follow those trails, and asset seizure and forfeiture, take it away. And then what we need to do is publicize it and humiliate the people involved, humiliate them in public forums around the world. Call them out on their corruption, call them out on their cheating, call them out on their hypocrisy, call them out and tell the world what they are. They are a ongoing criminal enterprise operating as a state.
To this point, how has been the feedback to your speeches and books and publications? It seems like it's again under the radar of the media. So how has been the feedback to everything that you're exposing?
Well, it's not me. I mean, I've been up to the Capitol Hill. I've talked to a lot of members. I've talked to staffers. I've given some presentations, but I am not well known in the United States. You know, it's very hard to get attention. You need to have contacts. You need to have an agent. You need this and you need that, and that's just not me. I'm 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 law enforcement. I'm a recently retired Treasury special agent, and I don't have those contacts in the media. But that's okay. I do what I can do, and I try to fight the good fight.
Okay, but okay, I will rephrase it. So it seems like there is no demand from the side of the media. I mean, is it that it doesn't interest them, or they don't want, as you mentioned, they don't want to talk about it?
Well, part of the problem is being very, very candid is the media, the big media in the United States is also beholden to China and the Chinese market.
Yes.
And they don't want to do anything to upset that potential client.
Okay.
The same holds true with certain politicians in the United States, which I will not name, but we all know are probably
Yes.
beholden to the CCP and the
Yes.
CCP Inc. And so a lot of things that could and should be done are not being done. And it breaks my heart as a patriotic American to see what's happened to my country over the last few years.
Liking and subscribing is greatly appreciated, and it helps me keep this channel going. My goal is to spread the opinions and experience of the best people in this industry.
Yes, since we mentioned politics, the situation get worse with the open southern border. Like, how is it? I guess it's getting probably almost now. There is probably no way to get hold of it because the border is open. We have this year 20,000 registered Chinese crossing the border. So I can imagine it's getting worse by the day. Could you please elaborate maybe on the last 1 year or like the last few months? Because the situation is really getting worse with the influx of immigrants. I can imagine there is a lot of them who get involved in this, in illegal activities.
Yes, we don't know for certain, but probably over the last, say, 2.5, 3 years, well over 10 million people have come in to the United States over the open southern border. And increasingly, the northern border is also becoming porous. The problem, Richard, is we don't know who these people are. We just don't know who they are. And you mentioned the Chinese. The Chinese are the second largest group after Latinos. They're the second largest group coming in. But we're getting people literally from all around the world pouring into the country. And despite what a lot of liberal commentators in the press might say, these people are not coming in for family reunification purposes. They're not coming in because of global warming. You know, they're not coming in because they're refugees. They're coming in to make money. Money, whether legally or illegally, they're coming in to make money. But what is actually concerning as well is that multi hundreds of these people are also on our terrorist watch list. We know them because we've apprehended them. So we know that terrorists are coming into our country. And then you mentioned the 20,000 Chinese that we have a good estimate are coming. Most of these people are military age males.
Yes, exactly.
Military age males. We know that many of them have come into this country and they've gone to gun ranges.
Yes.
Yes, all of this, we know this. And our leaders that are supposed to protect us and defend our borders are doing nothing to stop this. It's frightening.
Good. My last question would be, what is it that you're researching currently or maybe following? What should we be looking at in 24 and 25?
Regarding, I'm sorry?
Yeah, regarding the topic, like with regard to the money laundering, like how is it evolving? What is it that we should be following if somebody's interested in the topic? Like what should they be looking at?
I would encourage everybody to look hard and fast at the proceeds of crime and who is benefiting from the proceeds of crime. Because really, it always comes back to cui bono, or who benefits, right? So whether that be, corrupt political leaders in your country, or whether they be organized crime groups, or whether they be parties in a third party or fourth party, or far removed, follow that money and value trail to decide who actually benefits. Then I would encourage interested parties and particularly policymakers in their country to dedicate a lot more resources to enforcement of the law, whether they be, customs violations or violations of the law dealing with organized crime, et cetera, and then take seriously anti-money laundering and counterterrorism finance. There's one other issue that I would just like to bring up in passing, because you're talking about a couple of years from now. I think a huge issue is going to become central bank digital currencies. Central bank digital currencies. And the reason I mention this is because China is right now kind of leading the world in the development of their central bank digital currency. They're doing this for control purposes more than anything else. That, and to guard against capital flight and some other issues that they have, and try to lessen the dependency on the dollar. I understand that. Of course, that's their right to do that. It's interesting from a law enforcement perspective. I look at this and I say, this will actually help us follow the money and value trails, a central bank digital currency. But Richard, I am 100% opposed to it, because I don't trust the governments involved, because similar to China, they will use it as a control mechanism, basically to negate somebody, to turn off the access to money. You cannot pay for your education. You cannot pay your utility bills. You cannot get on a train. You cannot get on an airplane. You cannot do anything. Your access to money will simply just be turned off. I worry about that, and I think this is going to be a tremendous issue over the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, John, thank you very much for your time and your insights. It was really, really interesting.
Well, thank you for having me, and I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have so many other explosive interviews on this and similar topics. Please check out my channel.